Welcome, everyone. If this is your first time, my name is Jake, and I have the wonderful privilege of leading this village that we call Aldea. So we're so thrilled that you're here. And something that I've shared in the past is that when I was in my early 20s, I worked and lived on a cruise ship in Australia. And there was a point in time in that experience where I was the only person from the United States on a ship of 2,500 people. And it was a really incredible cultural experience, and it also led to some funny interactions. I made a lot of friends, a lot of which were from the United Kingdom, from England. And I would have this experience where when I would run into someone from the UK, they would always ask me if I was all right. They'd say, "Are you all right?" And I kind of want to do it in the British accent, but I feel like I don't want to do it because it's going to go online and I can't do it justice, and it's probably a bad idea for me to try a British accent. So imagine it in a British accent, but they would always say, "Are you all right?" And I thought, wow, the people from the UK are just so considerate, you know? And then as time went on, they kept asking me, "Are you all right?" And I thought, wow, like, is something wrong with me? Like, do I look like I'm not all right? And I'd say, "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm adjusting, I guess." And finally, then I had this interaction that told me something was off. I was passing someone from the United Kingdom in the hallway, and they said, "Are you all right?" And as I turned, they're already halfway down the hall, and I'm like, "Yeah, I'm fine. Thanks for, we're good." And I realized they did not care if I was all right or not. So I asked my friend who had, grew up in England, spent his whole life there, and I asked him, "Why does everyone keep asking me if I'm all right?" And he said, "Jake, that's just like how we greet everybody, They're just saying hello." And I'm like, "Oh, so they don't really care if I'm all right or not. They're just, okay." And I realized it's kind of like how in the United States we just say, "How are you? How's it going?" And a lot of times in surface interactions, we're not actually looking for the answers. Am I right? I mean, in the checkout line, you can't exactly get someone's life story. But as we do get to know people, something that does happen is that when we ask, "How are you?" we do want to know, right? We do care, and we do want you to answer honestly. And something that I've found as time goes on, as you ask that question, as you open up to people, sometimes you'll get answers like this: "I'm just surviving. I'm just hanging in there." And for me, I've picked up throughout my life on this type of answer, and I've found myself become sensitive to it, to hear kind of the deeper meaning behind it. And so for me, if I ask you how it's going and you say, "Oh, it's just going," just know I'm probably going to want to feed you warm soup and wrap you in a blanket. I don't know why. It just makes me sad. But the reason is because I know that feeling, and I know that you know that feeling. We all have experiences and times in life where life feels like something to be endured rather than to be enjoyed. We've all had moments and circumstances and seasons where life feels like something we are just surviving in rather than thriving in. And this can be because of circumstances. There are circumstances that we just need to endure. But then there's also the complicated nature of what it means to be human. And sometimes being human itself feels like something that we are just surviving through rather than thriving in. And we all know what survival mode can look like. Like, how many of you have exposed your phone to extreme heat or extreme cold, right? I've done both, and I remember, there was a point in time where I was in a 0-degree weather in Washington, which I know is not the coldest that many of you have experienced, but it's the coldest that I've ever experienced, okay? I'm a West Coast guy, so... And I remember my phone just shutting down and saying, "Hey, look, until we get back to a normal temperature, we're done for the day. We're clocking out, okay? You got to figure this out." And the same is true if you expose it to extreme heat, right? It's going into a survival mode, a self-protective way of being until something changes. And we see this in nature, right? We know what a porcupine looks like when it's going into survival mode, or a snail when it's going into survival mode. Or, my dog, she's still kind of a puppy, and so she's in this barking phase, and she'll just instantly go from being cuddly to insane growling and defending the territory. And that's her version of survival mode. And certainly we as humans all have a version of survival mode. for those of you with a significant other, you could probably attest to the fact that you've seen your significant other in survival mode, and it's not exactly pretty. When it comes to the for better or for worse kind of part, that's the for worse part. When they're in that, you've all seen it, It's these moments in life where we revert to our instincts. We revert to a self-protective way of being. Sometimes it's also how we strategize about succeeding in life. How many of you remember the show Survivor? Actually, you don't have to remember it because it's still on, but it's been on forever. I remember watching it as a kid, and I loved that show. But I was thinking about the tagline of that show: outwit, outplay, and outlast. How many of us have found that in some way, shape, or form in life, we bring that mindset into our daily interactions? That we on some level believe that to survive in life, we have to win. And for us to win in life, someone else has to lose. So we can bring this into our careers. Sometimes in our careers, we feel like we need to be the last one standing. We even can take this mindset into our relationships. And yet, unfortunately, this tends to leave us isolated and alone. But friends, I believe that there is much more for us than just to survive. I believe that we can actually thrive. And that's really the basis of this series, is this idea that maybe there is more for us. And I hold this belief not only because it's something that is written down and is a part of our spiritual traditions and is written down in our spiritual texts, although it is. And it's not something that I only believe because people wiser than me have told me that it's true, although there are many people wiser than me, and many of them have told me this. But it's something that I believe because I truly can look around and know that we've all experienced moments in life where life didn't feel like a burden, it felt like a blessing. Where life didn't feel like something we were grappling with, but it could feel like something we were grateful for. And that is the essence of thriving and of thrival. But that idea has been written down, and it has been told, it has been spoken and passed down. And there's incredible value to the fact that our spiritual traditions do point to this idea. Because if we look at our spiritual texts and our spiritual traditions, this is a way that our ancestors preserved ancient wisdom over many generations, using story, using ways of being that show up in different traditions. Because, before the written word, oral story and oral traditions were all that we had as a people to pass down wisdom. And then, of course, when writing became a thing, that's where we began to write this stuff down. And so spirituality and religion is really a technology for preserving ancient wisdom. And I believe that this wisdom points to a life that is more than just surviving. For example, if we look at the words of Jesus, I came to give life with joy and abundance, John 10:10. He doesn't say, I came to help you survive and endure this life so you can get to the next one. No, it's about living with a fullness and a vitality here and now. And we can see that this is something that even people in the ancient world struggled with and wondered about and questioned. Is there a possibility for a life of joy and abundance here in now? We might look to Buddhism and the Buddha's Four Noble Truths, all of which revolve around suffering and the escape from suffering. And the word that is used is dukkha, which is more in line with what we might understand as attachment, as our attachment of how things should be. And so the Buddhist notion of escaping suffering and thriving is really one of letting go of these attachments. And we can see that it's really about perception. It's about our minds and our hearts. So you might be in this room and you might be saying, Jake, this idea of thriving is all good and fine, but I'm not in a point where I'm thriving physically. You might say that I look in the past and I may never thrive the way I once did at a different point in life. And yet I love that what Buddhism is pointing us to is that thriving is something that happens within. It's something that we can make a choice about how we perceive the world and how we choose to live out our attachments. Lastly, the Greeks felt that and I'm speaking of the ancient Greeks. I'm sure the modern Greeks do too. You know what I mean? I'm talking about the ancient Greeks, just to be clear. I love Greek food, but I just want to put that out there. So, the ancient Greeks believed that the goal of philosophy was human flourishing, was to give us the best life that we could possibly live. Yes, all these amazing ideas that we have today that come from the ancient Greeks still survive and are still important and valuable, but they didn't just come up with all these wonderful philosophical ideas so we'd look back and go, oh man, how smart those Greeks were, right? No, they believed that it was actually to serve a purpose, and it was for the highest level of human flourishing and human well-being. And they actually had a word for this type of flourishing, and that word was eudaimonia. And what this word actually means, if we break it down, is that the Greeks believed, or they had this concept and this idea that as human beings, we have something called a daemon, okay? And that's that middle word there. And their idea of the daemon was this aspect of ourself that acted as a connector between the human and the divine. And they felt that to be in eudaimonia was to be in alignment with your daemon. So we might think of this almost like higher self or spirit. Maybe from the Christian tradition, you might think of it as the Holy Spirit. And so the Greeks believed that this aspect of you that connected the human and the divine, this aspect to be in right relationship with it, to be in authentic alignment with it, was essentially equivalent to highest human flourishing. Now you might see that word and you might think daemon. That word is kind of close to demon, and you might think, oh, that's a little weird. So if you need a little help, just think of another daemon, and then that might help you out. When we talk about thrival throughout this series, I do want to acknowledge that's not an official word in the dictionary, but the thing about thrival, I think it should be, because survival is a word that we use in all these different contexts, and yet I think we need a word to describe that journey from surviving and that journey from just functioning out of our most basic self-protective instincts into a life of thriving and into a life of presence, into a life of alignment, of connection, of being centered within the self and having a connection with the higher self, with divinity. And I believe that this concept can really apply to so many different areas of our lives. And that's why I'm really excited about this series, because we're going to have an opportunity to talk about so many different aspects of what it means to be human and to thrive in those different areas. But today, I just want to start by naming the cultural moment that we find ourselves in and how that relates to thriving. And one of the things that really strikes me about our world today is that so many institutions that we have relied upon for so many years seem to be failing us. They seem to be falling apart. And one of the greatest examples of that is religion and organized religion. See, religion for so many years was how, as human beings, we look to religion or we look to that part of society to give us a sense of meaning, to give us a sense of what it means to thrive in life. And yet today we see that our institutions can no longer be trusted the way that we once could. And that many of the institutions of organized religion have given us views of God and ways of being spiritual that really don't resonate with so many of us anymore. And so in some ways, we're as a culture and a society, we're kind of moving past the old structures of religion, and yet we haven't yet found something meaningful to replace it with. But this new type of religion has arisen to take its place, whether we realize it or not. And this is something that I would consider the religion of consumerism, the religion of materialism. That is a centering aspect of our society today. And if you're thinking, I don't know if that's true, look at how much of our online shopping and all the advertisements, how much of it knows what you want before you even do, right? And if you're wondering if that's true, I know some of you out there are even thinking maybe we're being listened to, because you think about something, or maybe you talk about something and then the next day you have an ad for it, right? I want to do a little experiment just to see if this is true. I'm just going to try this out. Okay. You'll see what I'm doing in a second. Nose trimmer, nose trimmer, nose trimmer. Okay, so now tomorrow, just look at your phone and see if you got an ad for nose trimmers. So it's 2024 here in the United States, and when we think about our place in history and our place on the planet, we are a people that have some of the fewest survival concerns of any people that ever lived on this planet, and many people who today live on this planet. That we are not so concerned with making it through the day and surviving the day. But we look back 10, 20,000 years ago, and we see that life was a lot different, right? Life was a lot more harsh. Life was a lot more unpredictable. Like, just imagine if we were to have Aldea 20,000 years ago, and just to paint the picture, you can imagine I'm wearing like kind of a caveman, like the leopard print, like toga onesie thing, And so I show up to Aldea, and I'm just talking to people, and I go, "Hey, where's Ed? Where's Ed been?" And someone would probably say like, "Oh, Ed got eaten by a saber-toothed tiger." And I'd be like, "Oh yeah, that makes sense because it's 20,000 BC and that stuff happens all the time." That's what life was like. We're not in that world anymore, and we're so lucky not to be in that world. We're not in a world that most people who ever lived had to endure through. And in fact, if you look at our position here today in the West, see, on our worst day, we're not having to worry about clean water, food, shelter. And yet, why is it that in the modern day, here in the West, we are some of the unhappiest and unfulfilled people who ever lived? It seems incredibly counterintuitive. And yet, if you think about it, it makes sense. See, we have these conveniences that have given us more time and more opportunity to reflect on our place in the world. And if we think about Maslow's hierarchy, Maslow was a psychologist who essentially believed that as our needs got met on lower and lower levels, the nature of our needs changed. So as we got our basic survival needs met, our needs and desires shifted and moved upward towards connection and community and meaning in our job. And as you go higher and higher up the hierarchy, what you find is that the more that your needs are met, the more existential your needs become. And so when we think about this in terms of our world today, what we see is that survival and our sense of survival has shifted from being something that's external, our external environment, and shifted into something that's internal, our internal experience of meaning and fulfillment, that sense of, am I okay? Even when physically I know my needs are met, am I actually okay in the world? And our internal experience, day to day, can provide a lot of different things, right? Like, how many of us throughout the day, we would be able to say that, yeah, I experience a little bit of anxiety, maybe some fear, some worry, some overwhelm, maybe feelings that, I'm not enough, right? Now, all these feelings, they're actually survival mechanisms. They've been survival mechanisms throughout history. When we think about how we evolved as a species, anxiety at one point in time served us because it was good 20,000 years ago to have a little anxiety and think, oh, maybe I need to go hunt, my tribe needs to eat, right? But also, these things have served us in our lives. These survival mechanisms actually show up in our lives, particularly if we look at childhood. Maybe for some of you, you can look back to childhood and you can say, at an early age, I learned to be hyper aware of what was going on around me. Maybe my family life was unpredictable, and so it was actually a survival mechanism to learn to be very much hyper aware of what was going to happen. Or maybe even more so, you learn how to sort of mediate between your parents. You learn how to manage your parents' emotions. These things that once served you as a survival mechanism, they translate and they become anxiety and worry and feeling of overwhelm as we age, as time goes on. And so survival is really concerned with the past and the future. It's concerned with the past in the sense that it's thinking, what's happened? What do we know could happen, right? And how can we predict that? And then it's concerned with the future. It's thinking, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? Thriving, friends, thriving can only happen in the present moment. And in this sense, Buddha was right. Our attachments to how things should be is really the core of this dynamic between survival and thrival, because survival is so much based on how we think things should be, whereas thrival looks at how things actually are and accepts how things are. To thrive is to be okay with how things are in the moment. And that might even mean some of the most difficult circumstances. How many of us have found that even in incredibly difficult circumstances, in the midst of a loss or a diagnosis or incredible change, how many of you found that you actually were able to be present in a certain way? Because anxiety and this concern with the past and the future, it's often about wondering what's the worst thing that could happen. But then in an interesting twist, when the worst thing does happen, there's an interesting sense of presence that comes because you no longer have to deal with that anxiety of the past or of the future. If we can be present even in our most difficult moments, we actually see new possibility, new life open up for us on the other side. The philosopher Ken Wilber has this interesting idea about how suffering actually acts as a gateway to show us that if we can let go of just our attachment to how things should be and we can accept some of the suffering of life, we can actually see that on the other side of it, there is a new life and vitality. He says this: the movement of descent and discovery begins at the moment you consciously become dissatisfied with life. A person who is beginning to sense the suffering of life is at the same time beginning to awaken to deeper realities, truer realities. For suffering smashes to pieces the complacency of our normal fictions about reality and forces us to become alive in a special sense, to see carefully, to feel deeply, to touch ourselves and our worlds in ways we have heretofore avoided. It has been said, and truly I think, that suffering is the first grace. In a special sense, suffering is almost a time of rejoicing, for it marks the birth of creative insight. Friends, when we make that choice, or we acknowledge this belief that maybe I can do more than just survive. You know, when we say to ourselves, I don't want to just be on this roller coaster of I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm comfortable, I'm uncomfortable. I want to get off the ride entirely and experience a new depth to life that can accept the joys and the pains in kind. When we make that choice for ourselves, it's often the case that the people around us can't fully understand it, because often the people around us maybe have never even considered the fact that that type of thriving is possible. And sometimes we need to know something is possible before we can believe it to be true for ourselves. This is Roger Bannister. He broke the record for the 4-minute mile in 1954. And up until that point, no one had ever ran a mile in under 4 minutes. Now, it's possible that maybe like thousands of years ago, someone outrunning like a saber-toothed tiger did run a 4-minute mile. But in a time of actually recording and jotting down these records, and they had been doing that for at least 100 years prior to 1954, and in that time, no one had ever broken that record. And so when Roger Bannister did, they thought, man, what a miracle, maybe even a fluke that this happened to occur. Maybe it was just the right weather conditions. Maybe there was just something about it that was just by chance he was the one that was able to do it. But not 46 days later, the record was broken again. And then a year after that, 3 people in one race broke the 4-minute mile. See, the 4-minute mile has often been used as an allegory for how we don't believe things are true, or we don't believe things are possible, and so they're not, right? It requires us to actually see things and to believe, another human being could do this. Maybe it's possible for me. And until we allow that belief to shift our reality, our bodies won't be able to follow suit. And I wonder if this is true when it comes to thriving. That until we believe that it's actually possible to thrive, until we believe that it's actually possible to live in a way that can accept the full reality of life and still find a joy and a peace in the midst of it all, until we believe that that's possible, maybe it will be hard for it ever to feel like it could be true for us. How many of us can look at our unique spiritual journey that we're on, and you might be able to say that I'm here, that I've been on this path because there was a moment in my life where I said, what if I could do more than just survive? And in that moment, maybe you could look back and you could say that there was something in you. Maybe it was your daemon. Maybe it was your higher self. Maybe it was God. Something was drawing you towards a newer, a deeper, a fuller way of living. The Baal Shem Tov was a Jewish mystic who founded Hasidic Judaism, and he says this: "Let me fall if I must fall. The one I will become will catch me." This quote has brought me great comfort in my life in various seasons where I felt like I was stepping out into the unknown. I felt like maybe I was falling. I was unsure of what the path forward was. And yet it gave me this sense that I could trust the deepest part of myself, and I could trust my connection to the divine to lead me forward. See, friends, when we take that first step into thriving, it's going to feel a bit like a fall, because we will be leaving the safety behind of purely existing in survival mode. And yet I believe that there is something that will arise, an aspect of yourself, maybe God, something will arise to support you in that journey. And so throughout this series, we will be really having a conversation between the higher and the lower self, between the part of you that believes that all you can do is survive and the part of you that knows that there is more. But I do want to make a caveat. When we talk about the survival aspect of ourselves, I want to be clear that that part of ourselves is not evil. It's not sinful. It's not stupid, okay? It actually has saved you and has protected you, not only throughout history and throughout your ancestry, but also in your life. That many of these aspects of yourself, they arose as protective mechanisms, and they've been really just trying to keep you safe. But we're in a place in history, and we are all here in this room, we are in places in our lives where we have the opportunity to look at the survival aspect of ourselves, transcend it, and yet include it, to say, hey, you don't get to drive anymore, but you can still sit in the passenger seat. So where survival would say, we don't have enough, we need more money, we need more approval, Thrival would say, what if we don't need those things? Where survival is concerned with what if we don't get, Thrival says, what if we don't need? Where survival says, look at all we have to do to live in this world. Look at all we have to do. Thrival says, look at all we get to do. Where survival says, I need to make sure all my needs are met, and I really can't trust anyone else out there to do that for me. The only person I can trust is myself. Thrival says, if you let go and you trusted the community, you trusted your interconnection with everybody, you'd see that your needs are all already met. Where survival says, well, if I don't worry about the future, how can we be sure that we're going to be okay? And Thrival says everything you need is actually right here in the present. And lastly, survival says, my job is keeping you alive. Like, we can't even think about death. That's like the antithesis of what I do. And Thrival says, life's meaning isn't in spite of the fact that it's temporary. It's because it's temporary. And I want to close with this today. There's an ancient story about a rabbi who was living in a city occupied by the Roman Empire. And one night, he goes down the wrong street, and he finds himself going down a road late at night full of Roman guards. And one of them runs out to him, weapon in hand, and he screams at him, and he says, who are you, and what are you doing here? Who are you, and what are you doing here? And the rabbi responds to him, and he says, how much does the Roman Empire pay you to ask me these questions? And the soldier replies with his salary. And the rabbi says, I'll pay you double to come to my house every morning and ask me those same questions. See, friends, when we have the courage to actually look inward, to question, to wonder, am I thriving? Am I experiencing the most meaning that's possible for me? Who am I really? What am I actually doing here? And am I living that out now? When we have that courage, I can't promise you that that's the easier path. It's not the easier path. But I do believe that it creates so much opportunity for us to experience a deeper and truer form of life that's available to us. Carl Jung said this, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Until we admit that in some areas of our lives we are just surviving, we won't be able to experience the fullness of thriving that we can. Until we take a good, long, hard look at some deep parts of ourselves that maybe are overly concerned with safety and protection, there's a level of freedom that we might never experience. And until we can break this addiction to past and to future, we may never fully be able to experience the present. So Aldea, throughout this series, I just want to invite you to be bold, to be courageous, to take some of those hard looks, to ask some of those hard questions, so that together we can take a step beyond survival into thrival.